Thank you. Thank you for the kind invitation. I'm delighted to be here. How many of you are in Moorhead right now? Raise your hand. Oh, wow. That's so you've still got some kind of bodily togetherness going on, huh? That's so important. It's hard in these times. When we first got in touch, I was delighted to hear from Moorhead because my parents actually went to that school and met at Concordia Moorhead. So we have a little heritage there anyway. We're going to talk today about ideas for creating, generating societies that are healthier for humans, that are healthier in spiritual ways, in moral ways, in ecological ways. I know that's a big challenge. I think it's one that's worth living for, even if it doesn't look like there's a good chance of winning today. So that's going to be the broad goal of what we're trying to explore. I started out my career working in South America. I actually worked full-time and lived full-time in South America for 15 years, mostly in Bolivia and Brazil, and worked a lot with rural communities in the Amazon, in the Andes, who were managing their common areas, their natural resources, and also their human resources, working together to regenerate their communities and their traditions and languages. And I admired and learned so much from the way the different traditions of managing that regeneration of life, and also accompanied the people I work with in great concerns about increasing pressures from extractive industries, pressures from expanding use of the forests, of the mountains, mines, logging, agribusinesses that were encroaching on their territories and also on their bodies through extractive labor, where people worked very hard, grueling and dangerous jobs and were paid so little that it wasn't really enough to reproduce their lives in that role, right? And so it was this kind of mixed situation. And after that, I went and worked in Europe for 5 years teaching sustainability studies amongst some of the most exciting, challenging scientists in the world, studying resilience, studying planetary boundaries, measuring out how the Earth systems were changing and degrading. Obviously, you've heard about climate change, also the oceans acidification, the loss of biodiversity and biomass, etc. And it was quite interesting then that the students I work with, the graduate students and my colleagues, but also everyday people in Northern Europe, were really enthusiastic about changing their own lives and questioning their own lives in order to respond to these global planetary issues of environmental degradation. And so this idea of degrowth, I really thrived getting to think and know in this realm, this theoretical political realm of degrowth in the last 15 years, because it's a way that allows me to connect those two worlds, right? It's a way that allows us to think, how can communities in the Amazon and the Andes live in more sustainable ways, regenerate themselves like they want to without all of those extractive, exploitative forces pushing in? And how can we in the North find more peaceful, more resilient lives for ourselves that don't take up more than our fair share of the world, and how they're all sort of connected. So that's the general overview. Now, I'm delighted to learn that many of you have actually already watched the introductory videos or read something. Everyone, more or less, just nod if you, all right, right. So I'm not going to feel the need to do an introduction. Of what I really like to do is to hear some of your ideas. I'd love to see your faces, those of you that are still not on video. But if you don't even share your faces, you can at least share your voice or put something in the chat, which I'll try to keep an eye on. All right, I'm just going to look at a few of the slides that were in one of the videos I shared, just to kind of get a little a basis. And what I would like to do is anyone that wants to, please just shout out, unmute yourself and shout out if you have anything to say. So the basic thing to start with is what are these various movements towards degrowth about? To begin with, they're all about forging healthier futures. One of the basic moves is slowing down global use of material and energy. Basically, we're talking about thermodynamics here. How much energy is transformed? Trees are cut down, oil is burned, metals are dug out of the ground. That creates entropy. We call it anthropogenic entropy, when humans push more entropy in the world that might have happened on its own, that leads to degradation, right? So just slowing down the total use of material and energy, the things we transform. And there's another piece of it, which is reorienting our values and the ways we see the world, our institutions, our religious beliefs and practices, our relationships, and so that they're not driven towards growth, but rather around caring for humans, caring for other nature, and equitable well-being, right? And so there's these kind of two parallel moves. One is basically thermodynamics. It's about the physics of the world. And the other is our values, our morals, our practices, our institutions, and they interact. As you know, what we believe and do and organize ourselves impacts on the world and vice versa. So those are sort of the two basic threads. Does anyone have any questions, ideas so far on that front?
I would have a question related to that.
Please.
If obviously completely hypothetical, if we were to be able to disregard that thermodynamic element that you mentioned, and there were only the social element, would you still push for degrowth?
Amen. I love that question. That's great. And it's a really important question. Some people talk, you may have heard about decoupling, which is this sort of fantasy. It hasn't happened anywhere yet, but this idea that we can keep believing and acting and doing everything the same way, but somehow we'll use technology to not hurt the environment when we do it. Yes, I personally would still like to move away from an obsession with growth. I would like my children, my students, myself, not to be driven to earn more and more money and buy more and more things, but to seek lives where they can feel different types of pleasures and relationships and satisfactions that aren't all sort of driven and couched in that competition for more, right? Which growth is about. So that's a great question. And that's right. Anyone else ideas about this very basic step? All right, so the thing about making this move, it's a historical move. The situation of colonial capitalist world that we live in now is very, very recent. You know, we've been humans walking, talking, living like this for 200,000 years. And it's only been the last few centuries that there's been any significant amount of humans engaged in wage labor, in expensive, in profit making, and these kinds of mechanisms in market-driven and market-dominated societies. So it's a very new and very unusual system. Right? At the same time, it feels omnipotent. It feels it's so internalized in our beliefs, in our lives. Some of you have probably, anyone here read about capitalism and the Protestant ethic? I think you might have mentioned this in your classes, in your religion and political economy classes, right? That's an early perception that's brilliant about how deep into our morals and values this relatively new political economic system has been. So it's hard to change. So people trying to find healthier paths are working on all kinds of fronts. There's not one way to do it, right? And so we have, you know, our own everyday practices, right? Do we recycle? Do we ride a bike or drive a car, et cetera? Our relationships, our the way we build cities and schools, our myths and values. Also, obviously, policies. I'm very interested in policies. That's something that we spend a lot of time debating. And movements, where people get together to try to make change amongst each other, right? So I just sort of lay out a paradox that when we look at the history of the growth of use of material and energy in the world, it really started to accelerate sort of in the 1800s. And then with the use of fossil fuels, with coal and then with oil and gas, really allowed humans to expand a certain type of production system that exploited more and more global resources. And so you see a very sharp increase in the last century, and it even becomes more sharp in the last 50 years, right? Just from year to year, how much oil is used, how much timber is used, how much water is used, has really increased. So the paradox that we deal with is that I think almost every scientist I've ever met or heard around the world says, dude, we need to curb that, right? Humans can't continue to use more water, more oil, more gas every day. And many activists, for all kinds of reasons, also resist against it. And they have for a long time. But at the same time, our politicians continue to tell us we have to grow. We promise growth. We must grow 3% a year or 2% a year or whatever. So businesses and politicians promise and push growth, whereas almost every scientist is saying, well, wait a minute, the growth of exploiting resources can't go on. So I don't know, it seems like a really overwhelming paradox. And I'm wondering if any of you guys have thought about, do you feel squeezed among those pressures? Anyone think of any way to bring them together?
So, like, I feel like it's so internalized in the way that both parties in the United States think. I'm currently doing a research project on the Green New Deal. And even in the Green New Deal, it talks about growth, about growing the renewable energy sector. And there's a lot of lines in there where it talks about reducing pollution as much as possible, but it doesn't say what that is, right? And so I don't know, like, I feel like it's been internalized to the point where we see not grow, like, it's kind of like a zero-sum game. So if we're not growing, we're losing. If that, yeah.
Yeah, anyone else? I have the same perception as Alexander. In the United States, left and right are equally pushing growth and promising growth. And the Green New Deal does say, you know, more prosperity, better wages for all, right? Other countries in other parts of the world also have Green New Deals. There's an EU Green New Deal that's very strong, that's been built in collaboration with representatives from all the European Union countries. And it's actually much more explicit about overcoming the drive for growth and profit. It actually has one of its key pillars. There's, you know, a set of half a dozen key pillars. And one of them is move away from the drive for growth, the drive for GDP, and the personal values of need for growth, right? So that's really quite amazing. And like I said, I taught sustainable studies in Europe, and it is a really different political landscape. There's few countries in Europe where all the parties are saying we've got to grow. I mean, green parties are stronger in many places, and also just different ways of looking at things. So that's one thing that, you know, for all of you that in your lives can be a quite liberating factor, is to learn and read beyond our own countries and see what different approaches. And I mean, from where you are, obviously you're getting the news all the time from Canada, and I'm sure you know people that live in Canada. And so you have right there a different, a different way of approaching some of these issues. All right, so people are working on a lot of fronts to deal with this paradox, right? One is something that we call decolonize our minds, right? Just the desire for growth is so deep in our sense of what it is to be a good son or a good daughter, what it is to be a good citizen, what it is to be sexually attractive. They're all tied up with this need to sort of earn more, produce more, consume more, display more. At least that's the messages that many of us are receiving, and they're deeply embedded in our bodies. Right? And so this idea of decolonizing ourselves from these myths and values and stories that are part of who we are, you know, we become human in that world. So that's the first step. That's perhaps the most intimate step. Another move is conversations between science and activism, right? So people from really different epistemological locations, and also between North and South, and among different countries. Like I mentioned, you know, different countries have plans, talk and read and learn about how different people are doing. One way that I'm very interested in is working to think about change in ways that motivates and empowers all kinds of different people to immediately change their lives and change their impacts on the world. So we don't have to wait for a global revolution. You know, I can talk to my son and daughter differently today. I can engage with my students and set expectations for competition and display and things like that differently than I may have before, when I was trained to produce competitive producers for a expanding society, right, as a professor. So there's a lot of different things that each of us in our different locations can do. And so that's really important to me, that we start changing our paths to becoming human. So thinking about change. And then another thing that, as an anthropologist, I've been engaged with different anthropologists, is actually learning from people all around the world that have really different systems. People that I work with in Latin America, many of them still adapt and practice and reproduce in changing context, really deep traditions of community management and caring that assure equity among community members, looking after for each other, looking after their watersheds, their rivers, their forests, not overfishing or overhunting, their mountainsides. Those people coexist with the drives in the world for growth. In fact, development projects come to their town and say, you guys have to produce more, right? Yeah, we're going to give you some technology and money and loans to produce more potatoes, which means you're going to have to, you know, you're going to use up all the hillside that used to be for the sheep and the goats, but you know, they're going to go into the forest. But they coexist with those drives for growth, and yet they coexist in this kind of tense way. And I think we have so much to learn. I have learned a lot from people who continue to practice very different worldviews in global context of colonial capitalism. They're not on an island of some kind of isolated culture. They're part of this world, and they're also different than I am. They move through it in different ways. They have different values. And I think that's a really, for me, a really promising way. So now I'll just share this image that I really love, that we use in our gatherings and to talk about. You know, some people, they want growth. They talk about green growth. We're going to have more for everyone, but it's going to be green. They talk about equitable growth. It's going to be more fair. We're going to have more, but we'll share it better. That's not what we're talking about, right? Some people talk about steady state. Let's just conserve and maintain the world we have. Let's keep the status quo. Let's be sustainable and sustain the status quo we have, and make sure that our children and grandchildren have the same status quo. Then there's this idea of recession, which is not degrowth. Some journalists have thrown around the headline like, oh my God, the pandemic, incomes are falling and GDPs are falling. That's degrowth. That is not degrowth, right? Just less of the same, a diminished or sort of weakened version. That's not at all what degrowth imaginaries are about. They're about building a whole different world that's not oriented towards accumulation of ever more profit. That's oriented towards different goals, right? So that's a really anyway, that's a sort of visual imaginary that helps us think about things. What, anyone here have ideas on that front? About how we can imagine different worlds? Here's another picture. I think you may have learned about neuroplasticity. Some people, if you've had biology class or psychology class, our brains are always growing and changing, just like the ballerina that practices certain moves and rhythms every day gets a certain type of body, and the linebacker in football that practices moves and has a different body. Our brains are the same, right? Depending on the skills we practice, the moves we make, the relationships we engage in, every single day our synapses build and rebuild themselves. And so this image also, it helps us think about, it's pretty hard. If you grew up on the brain in the left, does anyone feel familiar with that brain on the left, that gray brain? Anyone ever feel they're in that space? You know, how do we find our way? We have to recreate bit by bit new pathways in our neuroreceptors, right? And sometimes, for example, people, I would admit myself, you know, I grew up in a very competitive world. I'm always working and publishing and traveling. And it can be hard for me just to be still, just to sit like the people here and look at the grass and the trees all day. I'm just not used to it. Like, and I know other people for whom that is enormous pleasure, and like the biggest pleasure in their life is to sit and look out at their fields and look at the forest, right? And so those are processes through which we make ourselves. Well, we make ourselves in relationship with our institutions, our schools, our churches, and the world around us that is constantly training our synapses. Absolutely. Great question. There's all kinds of cycles of growth, right? Growth is the most beautiful thing on earth. That's how humans and all other creatures live and reproduce, right? A little plant, it starts with a seed, it grows into a seedling, and it grows into a tree, but then eventually it dies. But that organic matter rots and becomes the nourishment for a new little tree to be born. That's absolutely wonderful, right? So growth is great. That's what regeneration and resilience is about. And what I just described is what biologists, ecologists call cyclical growth, right? It's different. Each organism is born, comes to fruition, and dies, right? That's great. There's nothing natural about endless growth. A seed does not grow into a beanstalk that goes all the way up to heaven. You guys know Jack and his beanstalk? Right? Did you ever see a tree that just grows and grows and up into the International Space Station up there? It doesn't, right? A human embryo doesn't grow up into the giant. There's like a certain cycle. It grows to a certain level, it stops growing, becomes decaying, and then degrades and offers nourishment for the next round, right? So this endless growth is what's not natural. It's certainly not true that growth is flawed. It doesn't seem to me true. Growth is flawed, growth is bad in any way. Growth is the most wonderful thing on earth. The problem is the idea of endless expansion, right? That our economy should keep growing and growing and growing. That we harvest 100 trees this year, 120 trees next year, 150 next year, 200 the following year, 300 the following year. And that the good thing is that we should harvest more and more forever, right? This perpetual growth. And then lately, a really bizarre thing has happened, which is called compound growth. It's not just like linear growth, like, okay, every year I grow 10%. But it's like the pandemic. You know, you can have the same rate of infection. Let's say 1 out of 10 people that gets touched is infected. But when you start out with 10 people, the next day there's 11. But then when you have 11, the next day there's 11.1. And then by the time every time the amount gets bigger, And so what we have now is not only the dream of endless linear growth. We're going to consume whatever, 10%, we're going to produce and consume 3% more every year till kingdom come. But also each year that you produce 3% more, your economy and your consumption gets 3% bigger. And so the next year when you add 3%, you have that much more. You understand that math of compound growth? There's a great story that we have in the book. I just love it. It's the kind of myth of this guy that invented chess. And there is this Raj in India or someone that was just thrilled with the game. He's like, I'm going to give you a reward. What do you want? He's like, oh, I want a very simple reward. I would like you to put 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard, 2 on the next, 4 on the next, 8 on the next. And on the last one, there was 2 billion grains of rice, right? It was like a tremendously huge thing, because I mean, the guy's a mathematical genius. He knows how compound growth works. And it's just unimaginable how big something can grow that way. So thanks for your great question. I certainly don't think all growth is bad or growth is flawed in any way. Growth is what the world is about. The problem is this idea of endless growth, Jack and the Beanstalk, the giant and the giant, and also compound growth where we're just using more and more and more resources. Well, Rachel, that's great. That's the question. How do I live my life each day? And that's totally admirable of you that you're trying to nurture your own food at home and grow and cook. And that's a beautiful path. It comes into conflict with a world where you're expected to work all the time. So first I'm going to talk about policy, and then we'll go back to your personal life. So in the US, it's really difficult for many of us to be able to invest more in caregiving and caretaking and nurturing and growing our own food and music and art, because the political economic system is set up to demand that most people work at least 40 hours in order to get the very basic guarantee of survival, which is get your health care, right? Get your retirement allotment paid and things like that. And also people who don't even get their health care and retirement, those basics paid, end up maybe working 2 or 3 low-wage jobs that don't leave time for that more simple, basic living, right? And end up having to do a lot of consuming, right? Commoditizing everything, right? I have to buy my food at McDonald's. I have to take my children to the daycare center and pay someone to look afterwards because my labor is demanded 18 hours a day, and I can't caregive and make life the way I want to, right? So I become a commodity, and I also have to commoditize my own expenses, right? So that's a really tricky cycle to get into. And in terms of policy, it's something that is really central to degrowth, is a reduction in work hours. Now, many European countries have reduced long ago, decades ago. France went down to 37. Holland now I think is at 32. So basically they're saying, look, we have tremendously productive societies. We have computers, we have containerization, we have artificial intelligence. One human work hour produces so much stuff and so many services that we definitely do not need to have more humans working more hours, right? Basically what it ends up doing is inventing a lot of more like pretext for buying stuff, like, oh, you should buy different clothes every month because a new style came in, so then we can put more people to work, right? So the idea is we're so productive and so creative and good at doing economy that we can just work less hours each. Let's set it up at 30 hours each. We'll certainly make enough goods and services to satisfy everyone. It allows a little more space for people that don't have access to jobs to get access to jobs. And it allows people like Rachel to spend more time gardening, going to farmers markets, canning her fruits and vegetables. So in the long, cold winter months, she has her homegrown food, and making those choices. Not everyone's going to make those choices, and that's fine. Other people might still want to work at McDonald's and spend their time writing poetry, or jamming in a rock band in their garage, or doing all kinds of different things, which is great for me because it's not hurting the environment, it's not hurting people, it's not exploiting others. I'm very happy for them to do all kinds of different activities during those times. Wonderful question. So I'll give you one example. Bhutan. Anyone heard of Bhutan? A little bit. It's a Buddhist mountain nation in the Himalayas. And about 35 years ago, they were aware, like, you know, we're not developing the way England and the US and et cetera is developing. So that's one thing. And they had the prescience to sort of say, we don't need to follow that path. We don't need to be sort of the losers in copying Western people and trying to catch up with them, right? And so they promoted something that's called gross national happiness. And it's a goal that's been around for decades, and they've continually sort of worked on adapting a set of indicators whereby the government would work towards and measure those goals. And some of them are very familiar to you. You know, nutrition, good nutrition for all, education levels, housing levels. They also have things like richness of community cultural experiences, equity in distribution of income and wealth across nations. Mental health is a very important one. And peace, tranquility is a very important one. Only a Buddhist country would have like their national political goal. You know, Mitzi's like, what would politics look like? Okay, their politicians are like, okay, what plans can we do to make things more peaceful for people? You know, what are the challenges of peacefulness that we're dealing with? Let's really address them so we can raise our indicators on this piece, right? So look it up, Bhutan gross national happiness. Again, it's been around for a long time. They've been thinking about it. And it's just one case amongst, you know, there's many different cases, but maybe not so comprehensive, where they basically say, let's continue to do politics and economies and policies, but orient them around a set of goals that isn't getting more money, right? The goals for their country isn't get more domestic growth of cash, right? Their goal is this other set, this set of clearly defined social goals, or, you know, they're also environmental goals that they want. So that's one example. And I would say that I think it's a little bit cheap and easy to say all governments do now, you know, all around the world is push for growth. That's not really true. I think it does seem to be a very powerful narrative. And there's this, the slide that I have up right now, this kind of myth, which is empirically totally untrue. That's basically GDP growth leads to all those goods that we want. Oh, you want more education, you want more peacefulness, you want less mental health problems, you want less incarceration, you want whatever, more literacy, less child death. Oh, all you need to do is get more GDP and you'll get all those things. Well, the empirical science is very, very clear. It doesn't correspond. The countries with highest GDP, I live in the United States. We have almost the highest GDP in absolute and per capita terms. And everything that's listed on this panel here, we are way behind. In many cases, we're number 20 or 30 in the world in terms of infant mortality, in terms of literacy, mental health, incarceration. We're very low on the list, right? So having a great GDP doesn't mean that my country, the United States, has somehow advanced in moving towards those goals that we want, right? So many countries do more explicitly. I mean, the US also works towards those. We just haven't been as successful as other countries in achieving them, right? So, but But I would say most countries I know of, they also work towards these and many other goals at the same time. Right. So we just saw the sign. We saw a page with a lot of stuff where the US things, in my measure, haven't been going very well in the past half century of growth, right? We're talking about education, literacy, child mortality, obesity, obsessions with food, alcohol, drugs, suicide. Things haven't been going. Equality of education, of education and opportunity have been going very poorly in relation to other wealthy countries. Layla points out things have been going great for the US in terms of technological, economic development. We have the biggest, strongest military, and that has allowed us to push around other countries and have a certain, and she's like, who wouldn't want to do that, right? Yeah. Would we want to become Bhutan and lose that ability to push around other countries because we have the strongest military? That's a really tough call. That's a super, super important question. So the question is, if we assume that we exist in a world of competitive nations, that whoever has more military economic power gets to push other nations around, is it necessary? Is it a priority for us to put a lot of our eggs in the basket of that political economic power at the cost, at the very, very heavy sacrifice of things I mentioned before, of addictions, obesity, huge incarceration rates, extraordinary inequality in wealth and income and in educational opportunity, et cetera, right? Are all of those costs worth pushing so that we can keep competitive and whatever, have our military power against China? I mean, that question is beyond my pay grade. That's, for me, on one level, it's a religious and moral question. Right? Layla's talking about political science. It's a political science question. But there's more to it. It's about what world do we want? Do we want a world where we sacrifice humans and children and everyone so that we can clobber another country across the world? I mean, that's a moral question, right? And that's, how does that fit in with politics, is something that we need to think through. It's a really... So you have like 12 questions there. So Hannah, I saw you had some too, but we'll have to just address a few things here. You started out by asking, how can an individual make some changes in their life? With the really interesting question that all of these students here are paying a lot of money, their parents are paying a lot of making a lot of sacrifice to study hard with the idea of getting some kind of well-paying job, right? Is that, I mean, I don't want to say it too rudely, but is that kind of the idea? Okay. degrowth isn't like, screw that, I'm going to go live in a hut and eat dirt, right? There's all kinds of things. Layla talked at the end and she said, well, maybe it's shifting from economic success being economic military power to economic well-being. But it's not only economic well-being, it's also spiritual, moral, relationship well-being. Right? I mean, a big part of this is the question of how closely obsessions with consumption are tied up with the need for the machine to continue grow. I already said that we are so smart and advanced that we can very easily make everything that humans need with very little work. But for the economy to grow, they've got to, in this century, invented this idea of creating consumption, right? Nurturing in you the need, the insecurity, the desire, the obsession to get more and more and more. More clothes, more cars, bigger, whatever. Unfortunately, that comes along with it, with a lot of related problems and insecurities that play out in the need for more and more food, more and more alcohol, more and more drugs, more and more sex, more and more displays. This idea that consuming more and more is somehow the way we're going to feel realized as humans is something that we get every minute in the media, and it goes really deeply. And for me, having well-being, not only economic well-being, but spiritual and personal well-being is hard if we're obsessed with some of those issues, right? If I have an eating obsession or drink that I want more and more all the time. So part of this is a simple practice of, often, I think in community and communication works much better than alone. You may say, this is great, I've got a high-powered degree, I'm going to get a high-powered job, and I can maybe live a more simple, more modest, more sharing life where my personal life is not driven around more and more consumption and display, getting more cars and more things, right? I can make little choices. I want to say a really important thing that troubles most of the students and people I work with struggle with the problem is that there's this kind of reactionary move that if you change anything, people call you a hypocrite if you don't change everything, right? We're part of this system where we all consume and produce a lot all the time. And if I say, oh, well, I ride my bike to work rather than drive a car. And then someone's like, oh, well, she jets off to Paris to participate in the climate summit. You guys heard that? And it's a real reactionary trick, because basically says, if you can't change the entire system at once by a world revolution disaster, you're not allowed to change anything, right? Because you're a hypocrite. People are like, oh, well, you know, she's a vegan because she says she doesn't want to hurt, you know, to like hurt the environment by exploiting too much resources. But then I saw that she wore leather boots. You guys, I see your faces, right? Everyone's, you know, that's a trick. We need to try to somehow find peace within ourselves so we're not susceptible to those type of accusations. Be free to experiment with life paths that are somewhat different, that aren't the expectation and the norm, without someone calling you a hypocrite, right? If you want to eat hamburgers, but also only eat them once a week, that's fine, right? I mean, anyway. Wow, each of those questions deserves a whole class. I'll start with Josh, the last. It's such a tricky thing to say we have everything we need. You know, what does that mean? Enough calories so that you don't faint, enough clothes so you don't freeze to death? You know, for humans, it's a tricky thing because our desires are shaped by culture. I think humans have always, well, humans 100 years ago, many of them had what they needed, and 100,000 years ago, many of them had what they needed. They lived rich, full lives. They created, they had stories and myths and kinship systems and religions. They were fully humans, and they lived rich, full human lives, right? So it's not like we are the only people in history, like, okay, we need all this cash. I need this car to become fully human, right? And that sort of works together actually with Fred's question about the profit motive spurring innovation. Certainly technological change has become much, much faster with the expansion of market capitalism, and especially actually with the last 30, 40 years of changing the rules of the game under what many people call neoliberal capitalism, which really facilitates a sort of trickle up of profit and benefits, right? It's created enormously fast technological change. There's no way about it. I'm not so quick to say that's good or bad. Is there anyone here that lives some tension with your parents and grandparents because the world works differently for you and it's hard for them to understand? I'm not saying that we shouldn't change, but I'm not saying we think change, that kind of really, really fast driven technological change is always in itself a goal. Again, I'll go back 100,000 years, 200,000 years. Humans have been enormously creative. Did you guys see in the news this week, they discovered in Colombia, in the rainforest, like a mile-long, beautiful portrait on stone painted. It's just magnificent. People have invented all kinds of wonderful stuff hundreds of thousands of years before capitalism was invented. So you're not going to tell me that the human brain is incapable of innovation, creativity, technological. I mean, we figured out how to domesticate plants and animals. But that's revolutionary, right? We figured out how to capture water and make irrigation. All of those things without having the profit motive. All right, what else are we going to go on now? Euro work hours, absolutely. Look, Europe, Finland, Holland, yes, they depend on unequal exchanges of access to ecological goods and human labor from weaker and poorer countries. So does the US, where people are working on average 50, 60 hours a week, right? So it's just a fact that more powerful countries, that's one of the things Layla was talking about, who gets more political economic strength. It allows you to access the bodies, the human bodies and the resources from weaker countries and exploit them for your profit. That's what it does, right? So that's probably a useful thing in the moment if you're a pragmatist about it. So that is part of the equation. I don't think it's necessarily reducible to this question of how many hours people work or don't work in Finland, because I mean, I lived in Scandinavia for years, and there's also a lot of sort of cultural things and old long-term cultural things about modesty and peacefulness and coziness and things like that. They're also at play there in alluring people to say we vote to work less hours. Another thing to say is Scandinavian countries are consistently ranked as some of the most competitive in the world in capitalist terms, even though everyone has, 10 weeks off annual holiday. When I live in Sweden, every child born, the mother got 9 months off, the father got 9 months off of paternal leave, etc. All of this stuff for caretaking, they're still ranked at the top of the world by Davos, etc., in terms of capitalist competition. So it's not like you can reduce these things to a certain equation. There's a lot of different factors that play together. But yes, we should be aware that when we work less hours, it's not because we're just going to take more stuff from the poor people in the South that are working more hours for us, right? It also involves choosing to consume less, right? We work less hours, we produce less, and we consume less, right? And maybe we can go back to, right, instead of buying all of our food at restaurants, you know, we can make it. Well, that's a long story. That's a whole another semester. But people have used money as tokens of exchange in all kinds of situations for a long time. What your professor is talking about is a generalized monetary system where you've got a universal, money is a symbolic system, right? You've got a universal symbolic system that allows for change, and it works for interest-bearing debt, right? That's been around for a while. It's been a great debate. As you know, in the Bible, it was debated. Pope John Paul really motivated a jubilee against all debt for the new millennium in 2000 as a religious issue, that debt is an evil thing and it shouldn't happen. So there's all kinds of debate about it. Right, those things to talk about. There's also, I didn't even mention, a whole new realm of thought called modern monetary theory, which is basically like, we just invent money anyway. Countries just invent money. Let's just invent money and buy whatever we want, like healthcare and education and stuff like that, instead of just inventing money to buy bombs. So there's a whole bunch of theories going there, but you're right. Money is a key element here. It's a symbolic system that's at the heart of our lives. It's internalized into our desires, into our marriages, into our parental expectations, into education that you guys are receiving. Almost everything in our life is now commodified. So that's all about the monetary system. All right, and then the last one, which I really appreciate, Hannah talked about decolonizing our minds and our systems. It's an iterative process. Remember, I had that whole list of all these different fronts that people were trying to work on. They all have to happen simultaneously, and they nourish each other, and they also break each other, right? Like like Rachel, you know, she wanted to live a more natural, nourishing, local food sovereignty, and she couldn't do it because the capitalist system demanded that she be at work 50 hours a week, et cetera, right? So there's these tensions, but also fruitful relationships that allow changes in your personal life, policy changes, religious changes, to sort of nudge each other forward and make new possibilities. That's really rich. And so the final thing I'm going to say, one of you basically said, you know, so does it mean it's just irrelevant because we can't do anything? I'll leave you with a thought from an environmental activist that I knew in Bolivia. We were at the site of a long-going struggle. People were trying to resist the incursion of extractive industries into their indigenous territories. And a woman said to me, Susanita, there's a big difference between optimism and faith. You gringos, you're optimist. It means, I think my team's gonna win. She said, faith means that you believe something, you're so committed to it, that you keep working even if there's not a chance in hell of your team winning. There you go. All right, friends, thank you for the motivating conversation. It looks like it opened a whole Pandora's box, and we'll keep in contact.